Hello and welcome to this Constitution Unit event asking, can the House of Commons handle multi-party politics? I'm Meg Russell, Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'll be chairing today's discussion. There's long been talk of the decline of Britain's traditional two-party model of politics, but this has taken on a fresh urgency in recent years. Since 2010, we've had a coalition government, a minority government, and highly fragmented party voting. In the 2024 general election, Labour won a landslide, albeit on just over a third of the vote, while the parliamentary opposition became far more fragmented. The traditional opposition party to Labour, the Conservatives, won just 121 seats, while the Liberal Democrats won 72. Reform UK won 5 seats and the Greens 4, joining other traditionally small parties from Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, although the Scottish National Party had also held dozens of seats in preceding elections. The new configuration in 2024 presented immediate challenges, which we'll perhaps discuss, but the current state of the polls suggests further challenges may be coming, with Reform outpolling the traditional two main parties and the Greens often outpolling the Liberal Democrats. The pattern of representation in the next House of Commons therefore remains very uncertain. Meanwhile, many of the Commons rules were based around assumptions of single-party majority government and an alternation in power between the two main parties. So how have those rules been bearing up recently, and might things need to change to prepare for the next election and future elections? We're joined today by a great panel who bring a mixture of insider knowledge and academic expertise. Paul Evans had a long career as a House of Commons clerk from 1981 until his retirement in 2019 as clerk of committees. Prior to that, he'd held numerous roles, giving him detailed insight into all parts of the system. He's a former chair of the Study of Parliament group, has written widely on parliamentary procedure, and is a long-time associate of the Constitution Unit. Ellie Chowns entered the House of Commons for the first time at the 2024 general election, representing the Green Party in North Herefordshire. She's now the party's parliamentary leader. She's a former local councillor and MEP and has taken a significant interest in parliamentary procedure and reform. Louise Thompson is senior lecturer in politics at the University of Manchester and a well-known scholar of Parliament. She's one of the editors of the key textbook, Exploring Parliament, now in its second edition, and of the journal Parliamentary Affairs. Her own work has taken a particular interest in the legislative process and also, crucially in this setting, small parties at Westminster. So we've got a wealth of experience on the panel, and we greatly look forward to hearing from all of you. The panelists will speak in the order that I just presented, starting with about 5 minutes of opening remarks each, after which I'll ask some questions of the panel before we open up to questions from the audience. Those of you listening on Zoom can submit your questions by using the Q&A function, and my colleague Tom Fleming, joining us here on screen, will select from among them and put questions to the panelists. If you want to submit your question anonymously, you can, otherwise Tom will by default read out your name. This whole session, including the Q&A, is being live streamed, recorded, and will be available afterwards as a video on the Constitution Unit's YouTube channel and an episode of our podcast. So you may want to bear that in mind when deciding whether to anonymise your question. That was a rather long introduction from me. I'm really keen that we move to our speakers, so let me pass over to Paul.
Thank you very much, Meg. So, as you point out, the duopolistic nature of British politics has been in steady decline for some time, but the framework within which it operates has not really kept pace with this. It's perhaps symbolised most clearly by the layout of the House of Commons chamber. All the government members sit on one side, facing them on the other side are the opposition. It's a bipolar system, and it's always been government versus opposition. The high point of the duopoly was probably the 1955 general election, where the two main parties won 96% of the popular vote and 99% of the seats in the House. And therefore, the House was highly representative of the way people had voted. It was also, incidentally, the last election in which Conservatives won a majority of seats in Scotland, which is an incidental fact, but not irrelevant in what happened subsequently. So by 1964, on 86% of the popular vote, the two main parties still held 99% of the seats. And since then, seats and votes have been in a steady but uneven decline. And the group, particularly below the gangway, sorry, which is where the smaller parties traditionally sit on the opposition side, has become increasingly diverse and, as Meg noted, made a spectacular leap in diversity in the last general election. So, as a rule, we have a different dynamic. And the duopoly, which hit its low point in 1983, when on 70% of the vote, the two parties still won 90% of the seats, has begun to break down. Not only did, as Meg points out, we had a surprising victory, I suppose, for most people, the Labour landslide, bigger than anticipated. And the Conservatives ended up with around 53% of the opposition seats on their vote. Since 1997 election, the average proportion of opposition seats held by the official opposition has hovered around 75% with surprisingly little change. So we've dropped down to 50%, 53% at the election, and probably now with defections from both Labour and Conservatives, the Conservatives may well have fallen below 50% of the opposition seats. The others, in the same way, since 1997, have hovered around 10%, the others being all the smaller parties rather than the official opposition, and have now leapt up to 17% of the total. And whereas in 1964 we had 3 parties in the House, we now have around 12 or 13. It's a bit difficult to be sure what the exact figure is, to be honest. So it's a completely different landscape, but the rules and conventions of the House of Commons have not really kept pace. As with the shape of the chamber, the rules and conventions are quite rigid. I distinguish between rules, which are standing orders, and conventions, which are almost always exercised by the chair. And they are much more flexible, but they haven't changed much in response to the changing landscape that looks before the chair sees before them. The most obvious rule that applies to the opposition parties is the rule that 20 days in each session are set aside for opposition business. The existence of a second opposition party wasn't acknowledged until the 1970s, at which point 3 of those 20 days were given to the second largest opposition party, and they were expected to give some of that time to the other opposition parties. So 17-20 split, since 17-3 split since the 1970s. On the basis of the 2024 election results, that split should be more like official opposition 11, Liberal Democrats 6, SNP 1, and the others 2 between them, maybe in 4 half days with her. However, there's been no shift and there's no sign of anything happening. And perhaps surprisingly, not much agitation seems to have been about that. As an example of conventions, at Prime Minister's questions, for a long time, there has been a tradition that the leader of the opposition gets 6 bites at the cherry in coming back, supplementary questions to the Prime Minister, and the leader of the second largest party has in more recent times had a tacit entitlement to 2. Again, if you base it on the 2024 results, that should be more like 4 to the leader of the opposition, 3 to the leader of the Liberal Democrats, and 1, perhaps on rotation, to the leaders of the smaller parties. Again, talking about convention speeches, there are many privileges attaching to being a frontbencher on the opposition, where you intervene in debate, how certain you are to be called in debate, how certain you are to be called at different times, and they have not been extended to the second largest opposition party to any great degree, and they now look rather out of balance. So it is a question of how could these conventions and rules be changed? Well, the rules depend upon the government initiating change. The conventions are more malleable and depend on the recognition by the Speaker and his deputies. But there haven't been significant changes. And underneath it all, probably, is the power of the usual channels, which I think all the audience will know are the whips and business managers of the committees, and much of the stage management and orchestration of what goes on in the House of Commons depends on those usual channels. They are very much dominated by the two major parties. Those parties, though they will sometimes and often do cooperate with the other parties, have pretty much a stranglehold over the stage management process, and that remains the case. If the 2024 result is replicated or creates an even more diverse House after the next election, especially if we have two significantly large opposition parties rather than two or three, perhaps, of fairly equal standing, it seems likely that these rules and conventions are going to break down, but we don't know how. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. There's already a great deal to think about in there, and we haven't even got to the experience of the person who is trying to operate this system at the moment. So we're greatly looking forward to hearing from Ellie. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Meg. Thanks, Paul, and thanks everybody who's here. As Paul set out, there are multiple ways in which the way that the Commons operates disadvantages small parties. And yes, I experience this literally every single day. In the kind of setup of this event, we were asked to consider three questions. First of all, does the Commons need to change its culture, practices, procedures to better reflect this era of more fragmented politics? And I would argue absolutely yes. Paul has talked about the allocation of time in opposition days, PMQs and so forth, mentioned briefly the way that Parliament is structured. There are so many things that I think could and should be changed in the culture of the way that the Commons operates. But there is also a point which we haven't touched on yet, which is that the inequalities in the allocation of time within Parliament and the allocation of other resources alongside time within the Commons are important, and they exacerbate the even more fundamental inequality in the way that our electoral system works. So we have this system in which the distribution of power, time, financial resources within Parliament reflects the number of MPs that have been elected for a given party, but that does not reflect the will of the public. And I think you mentioned, Meg, we have an incredibly unequal Parliament in which there's a 2/3 majority for the ruling party on the basis of only 1/3 of the vote. So absolutely, we need reform of the way that the Commons works, and we desperately need reform of the way that our electoral system works, so that the distribution of MPs better reflects the will of the people, as well as the distribution of resources in the Commons on the basis of MP numbers. And the particular challenges that face smaller parties in the Commons, the sort of second point you asked me to speak on, I mean, just a few examples, just today, right? One of the effects is that with 4 MPs in Parliament, and of course, if we had the number of MPs that accurately reflected our strength of support within the general public at the time of the last general election, we would have dozens of MPs. If we had the number of MPs that reflected our current popularity in the polls, then that would be hugely increased still further. But we have 4. So that means that each one of the Green MPs leads on at least half a dozen portfolios. And it means that, so for example, today, when we've obviously had the Public Accountability Bill pulled for the second time at the very last minute, the time has been filled with, I think we have 4 urgent questions, 2 ministerial statements, and all questions before that on education. And out of those 7 slots, I believe 6 of them are within my portfolio areas. It's simply not possible for an individual to cover all of those bases. And so we have to pick and choose. We have to try to be as strategic as we possibly can, and we have to divide ourselves in many more separate parts than most people within Parliament. And this really comes to the fore, for example, when you are front bench spokesperson on half a dozen portfolios, as I've mentioned, but you're also sitting on a bill committee or sitting on a select committee, which sits at exactly the same times that clash with parliamentary times. There is much more of a challenge of individuals being torn in multiple different directions, many conflicting demands on your time. And in addition to that, because of the convention that people in smaller parties get called on to speak later in debates. Generally speaking, for myself, despite being a frontbench spokesperson, I may well be in a debate on an important bill within absolutely an area of my frontbench kind of purview, but I may not get called for 4 or possibly even 5 hours. I've had a number of experiences where I have bobbed for 5 hours and not been called. I've had experiences where I've been called as the absolutely last speaker when we're down to a 3-minute speaking limit, and I've been told by the speaker, you've got 2 minutes basically. And so it isn't even just about the number of times that you're called, but about the time allocation that you receive, because generally speaking, a speaker who's called early on in the debate, certainly a frontbench spokesperson for the Conservatives or the Lib Dems, will get many effectively an open amount of time, many interventions, many time to come back. Backbench speakers from within the Conservatives will often get 15 minutes, and the frontbench spokesperson for a small party will get 2 minutes at the end of 5 hours if they're very lucky. In the meantime of which, of course, they may have missed the opportunity to participate in other parliamentary activities within their official responsibilities. So there's a huge challenge of being torn in many different directions. The third question, how can small parties maximise their impact within this? Well, you pick and choose, essentially, is the only hope that you have. That is partly down to individual preference, as well as the decisions that are made by the political grouping as a whole on what you prioritise. One thing that we may get onto speaking about that came up in the conversations we were having kind of just before this was the fact that the conventions have changed in relation to the formation of bill committees, public bill committees. So my understanding is in previous parliaments, nobody from a small party got a look in at all. You've got a 15-person committee and it would only reflect the 3 main parties. Now, since this parliament was constituted 18 months ago, there's been a convention that there is one place available on every public bill committee for a representative from a smaller party. And there is a very polite bun fight about how you get to be the person on that committee. So we used to have a single Green MP, Caroline Lucas, and I understand she didn't serve on any public bill committees during her 14 years in Parliament, because there wasn't that opportunity. I've served on 2 already, as have most of my Green colleagues, and hope and intend to keep on doing that. Again, that's an incredibly time-consuming task to do, but it feels very important because it's central to the role of scrutiny, parliamentary scrutiny of government proposed legislation. But we live in an incredibly centralised system, and so effectively what the government wants to go through generally will. Nonetheless, in bill committees, you do have an opportunity to make important arguments and put things on the agenda which may be taken up further in the Lords or indeed adopted by the government possibly. So these issues, the way that Commons culture and conventions and procedures reinforce existing inequalities generated by the electoral system do make things particularly difficult for small parties. The allocation of seats on select committees is another way in which those inequalities are reallocated, are reproduced and exacerbated. I do feel that there are some changes that could and should be made that would significantly improve things. For example, the conventions around allocation of speaking time and speaking order. I gave evidence to the Procedure Committee quite recently on arguing in favour of speaker lists. I've seen through a brief period serving in the European Parliament how other parliaments, can deal with these questions of allocation of time and resources more fairly. Fundamentally, yes, it is clear that Parliament needs to change. One final point on this, one thing that gave me a small degree of hope at the start of this Parliament was the formation of the Modernisation Committee. And I had the sense that Lucy Powell, as Leader of the House at that point, had at some level a genuine commitment to trying to modernise Parliament. Of course, Lucy is no longer Leader of the House. The Modernisation Committee has gone extremely quiet. It's published one report on accessibility, and everything else that was on its agenda seems to have been completely kicked into the long grass. So the mechanisms by which these changes can be argued for and sought by MPs and by those who want to change Parliament are themselves very obscure, very slow moving, and governed by conventions and procedures that I've got to admit I haven't yet got my head around myself either. So quite a lot of frustration living within this. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ellie. And given how busy you are, we're extremely grateful that you've managed to make the time to be here. Let us finally go over to Louise for her opening remarks.
Okay, thanks. So I wanted to think a little bit more about things that we could do to kind of start to think about fixing the situation. But first of all, I think the sort of three underpinning things that I think are important to do within that are to firstly provide greater certainty or guarantees around participation to different parties. And that is, whatever MPs I've spoken to from any opposition party, that is the one thing that seems to come up time and time again, that lack of certainty, which hinders parliamentary behaviour and performance. It makes things much more difficult than it needs to be. Secondly, about getting greater fairness between parties. And we could look at that in the sense of the difference in rights that Paul was talking about between official opposition rights compared to third party rights, which when we look at the current numbers seem not proportional at all. I think it's obviously got worse since the election, and I think I'm right in saying there are now more non-government MPs on the opposition benches for other parties than there are Conservative MPs. So it sort of feels like the right time to think about that, but also about within those small parties and the fairness between them and those parties who automatically get guaranteed privileges. And the third one is obviously that future-proofing idea for different electoral and parliamentary outcomes. And I don't mind saying in the run-up to the 2024 general election, I really, really wanted the second and third parties to get exactly the same number of seats, because I thought that would just throw up so much chaos that the standing orders wouldn't be equipped to actually decide what was going to happen. So I was a little bit disappointed on election morning. So future proofing as well, but also thinking about perhaps different government opposition situations, minority government, as Meg was talking about at the start. So I wrote down my list of sort of reforms and things that I'd like to see, and I've put them in my kind of order of preference, which I realise not everyone will agree with. And my top one is simply to start writing more things down and clarifying things more in the standing orders, to give that certainty to different political parties. Some of the things that are written down there at the minute are very vague. All this talk of things being done on the basis of party size, which are very much open to interpretation. But to cement some of those informal practices, the Public Bill Committee appointments that Ellie was just talking about, maybe it's the sort of the way in which small parties are called at PMQs every few weeks, sort of fixing that on a more formal basis so that they are guarantees and they're not open to change, and no one has to worry that those rights might be taken away in the future. And that's obviously something that other parliaments, I've looked at small parties in the devolved parliaments and party rights there. They tend to do this much better than we have at Westminster. The second one was, making existing rights more proportional. So picking up on what Paul was saying about opposition day debates, and that feels like a really easy win to make that division more proportional, whatever the split is. Perhaps it's what Paul suggested just now, but ensuring that smaller opposition parties get that half-day debate. It's been notable that in the 2019 Parliament, no opposition debates went to small parties, whereas before that, there was that kind of convention of sometimes they would get a half-day debate given to them by other parties, and that didn't happen at all in the 2019 Parliament. The third one, which is probably maybe unpopular in some areas, would be introducing some sort of threshold system for opposition rights. We have to draw the line somewhere. There are big differences between a party of 70 MPs and, a party that is essentially 1 or 2 MPs in the Commons, in terms of, what rights they should have, but also about their capacity to take up seats on committees and serve on bill committees and all of that. So, thinking about Scotland and Wales and the sort of thresholds that they use, 5 MPs, 3 MPs, we might need to be more than that at Westminster, but just thinking about maybe a number which would then give parties an entitlement to certain extra rights, committee seats, whatever that might be. Perhaps it could be proportional, like what percentage of the opposition benches you currently fill. but again, just to provide that more certainty and avoid those sort of informal negotiations that we often need to kind of get extra rights for opposition parties. And the fourth one was sort of establishing some sort of business committee, similar to what we see in Scotland and Wales, to make that decision making a bit more visible, to kind of bring other parties into those usual channels arrangements. I'm a little bit cautious about that one because I feel like there's a danger it would give other parties a seat at the table, but not necessarily give them a bigger voice in terms of decision making. And I've certainly heard from smaller parties in other parliaments that although they might have a place on these committees, they often feel that they're just continually outvoted and that there's no real benefit to them being there beyond maybe information provision and that kind of thing. So those are my four. I didn't talk about call lists, and Ellie is obviously very keen on a speaking order. I'm not completely convinced about those at the moment. And when I've spoken to opposition parties elsewhere, they've said to me time and time again that they feel like it restricts debate too much. But I'm open to that in the chatting about that more in the discussion, perhaps. So I'll leave it there for now.
That is brilliant, Louise. Thank you so much. And I feel like you've made my job a great deal easier in going to the other panelists, because the first thing I want to know is what they think of some of those ideas. But before we move to that, let me just remind the audience that we're going to be turning to you in maybe about 10 minutes. So if you haven't already submitted a question to the panel, please use the Q&A function to submit your question, and we'll come to those shortly. I am tempted, because we're very much in line with the sorts of things that I was thinking about asking panelists, to go over those options and put them to Paul and Ellie. Louise, could you maybe just begin for the benefit of the audience in explaining a bit more what a business committee is and how they work in other parliaments? Because I know, as you know, but it's a bit jargonistic. Maybe if you could explain that, and then I will ask Paul and Ellie what they think of some of these ideas and then come back to you.
Oh, I feel like I'm the worst person to do this definition, but anyway, so other parliaments would instead of having that behind the scenes arrangement between the whips, allow all parties, certain parties, depending on the size of a party that is considered to be a party group, will allow them a place on a business committee, which would meet to, in theory, consider business and timetabling and so on. And come to some level of agreement, perhaps. But in certain places, those votes are weighted according to party size. So in practice, this is why I'm more suspicious about how well it would work. That was a terrible definition.
I guess there's a trade-off there, isn't there? There are questions about not just having a committee, but the decision-making rule inside that committee. And I think what you're presenting is a number of different sort of partly competing logics by which we might organise the Commons. Should it be party blocks where parties have rights, which would be a bit in contrast to what we have now, which is more based on individual rights? Should it be strictly proportional, rather than there being sort of wiggle room and interpretation by the speaker? And should it be more written down, which similarly is traded off against maybe more speaker discretion? Paul, can I come back to you first? These questions about sort of strict proportionality, writing things down, business committee, what would your take be on that?
Well, let's start with the business committee. It is a common feature of many parliaments, especially European style, PR style parliaments. And the business committees will also sometimes be the same as the bureau. It runs the parliament in more ways than just procedurally. But I think, as Louise said, there is a risk that, and there is an inevitable risk that the small parties will always be outvoted, and that's politics, that's democracy for you. But it does bring a degree of transparency to the arrangements. And the problem with the usual channels is it's very difficult to find what water is flowing through those usual channels at any given time. It's usually about the same quality as Thames water's effluent. And that transparency would help. Recognising parties, and again, many, well, I'll just say on business committees, they can be oppressive. And the most finest example of that is in the House of Representatives in Washington, where the Rules Committee basically spends all its time eliminating minority rights. I mean, it's just a long time. They just sweep them away. So it's not always a good thing. a lot of parliaments allocate speaking time to parties, and the parties' managers then hand it out to their members. And that's one way of doing it, and it introduces a degree of predictability that Louise is asking about, and a degree of fairness, but it is at the cost of the business managers having much more control, especially over their dissenting MPs. So there are always downsides to these things, I think. And writing down. Well, you put your finger on the problem, Meg, and I think Louise admitted it too, that the problem with writing things down is it makes them rigid, but transparent and clear, but takes away the wriggle room and the opportunity to bend the rules more easily. I think it certainly needs, and especially if the 2024 result is replicated or exaggerated, as it were, at the next election, we're going to need to write down a lot more about what opposition rights are. The Commons has so far avoided the issue of parties, as I said, by and large, and as you added, Meg, it's going to have to come to terms with the idea of parties now, soon.
Thank you. Let's go over to Ellie and ask. No need to repeat things, but just get your take on some of these suggestions. And I'd be interested in what you think of the threshold idea, because of course there are 650 members in the House of Commons. If a threshold was set in line with other parliaments, your party would likely be quite a long way below it as things stand. So I think there is a tension here between individual rights and party rights, isn't there? You're sort of treated like 4 individuals in a 650 member chamber, and I just wonder, how you think that logic maybe ought to change, and whether it would be to your advantage or disadvantage.
So on the proportionality thing, I mean, this goes straight back to my original question about having such a grossly disproportional electoral system. And so absolutely, I think it is right that Greens should get more than whatever we are, 0.7% of the the total speaking time in the Parliament, because of course we represent a much, much larger proportion of the population, even in terms of vote share back in 2024, let alone now when we're polling at 17% or something. I really do agree with Louise on writing things down more. Having said that, I've never sat and read Erskine May or indeed any of the huge amount of detail about stuff that is written down about how the place is supposed to work. But for example, the point that you made, Louise, about seats on committees being distributed in proportion to kind of party group size. I mean, that can be interpreted in a number of ways. Like if it's every 15-person committee, it's proportional, then a small party will never get a look in. But if we've got a total number of X hundred seats on committees, therefore this proportion of them should be allocated with potentially special treatment even written in there for particular minority groups in relation to national committee, Welsh or Scottish or whatever. Making existing rights more proportional, yes, absolutely. And again, there's been a small shift towards that. For example, with being on the regular list of questions at PMQs, roughly every 6 weeks. We're on that at the moment. But again, making that more proportional. The issue with the threshold for opposition rights, yeah, like you say, Meg, it's the devil's in the detail there. I mean, my short answer now would be make it more than 4. Make it 4 or more, Definitely don't make it above what we are. That's a very self-interested argument. But I would, I would argue that as representatives of a national party, we should have a space within the stage on, basically any policy issue that affects the nation as a whole. Whereas in debates on Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, it is absolutely right that people, even if they're just from a one-person party, should have a particular space to speak in those debates.
Could I just cut in there for a minute? Because when you were speaking, I was wondering what's the solution to the problem that you presented of having to sit and wait 4 hours to the end of a debate. It sounded like you were suggesting that maybe all of the opposition parties should go at the start. So you start with opposition spokespeople for all of the parties before you move to backbenchers? Would that be your preferred option, and would that be fair to people backbenchers in the main parties? There's a real trade-off there, I think.
Yeah, so something along those lines I do think is where we should get to. There is absolutely a trade-off between party rights and individual speaking rights. There's absolutely a trade-off between having things written down and having the flexibility. My argument would be we are too much on the line of everything being within the discretion of the speaker, and this is not a critique of any of the individual speakers at all. They do an incredibly tough job in balancing all of the different demands on their time. And even when I'm behind the scenes sort of saying, why didn't we get a slot? I recognise the difficulty of that. But for example, in terms of speaking time, if you've got, say, a 5-hour debate, well, why not say, okay, the first 2 hours of that, there will be allocated time, or a first hour and a half or whatever, and you've got, 15 if you're head of a big party, you've got a guaranteed 5 minutes if you're the speaker for a smaller party. And so you have all of the different perspectives on this thrown into the pot at the start, and then you would have, I would hope, perhaps a more constructive, more of an actual debate, because so much of what passes for debate in Parliament at the moment still is, a lot of it is the trading of the same old insults from the government and the official opposition against each other. If you cut out all of the trotting out the standard lines that so many people are doing, you would create quite a lot more time for perhaps more engaged, more in-depth debate. And if you didn't have the situation where people representing other parties who might have a particularly unique take on it had to wait 4 hours in order to get a word in edgeways, and only then able to kind of really, really hugely squeeze it down, never getting any substantive response on that. I think if you introduce those ideas into the pot earlier on and move towards having a convention where parliamentarians are actually engaging with the substance of the different ideas that are being contributed, that could help improve the quality of debate overall. So yes, I do think that small parties should get a word in edgeways before we've had 20 Conservative speakers, for example. That's a real inequality. And I do think that having speaker lists where you have an expectation about the order that you're coming in could be compatible also with having space where it is then dependent on bobbing and attracting the attention and really making a particular point in relation to how the direction of how the debate is going.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shall I pass to Louise? I'm just getting a bit aware of time and wanting to get to the audience. Was there anything crucial? I'll pass to Louise, and then let's go to some audience questions. And there's one thing I'm very keen to ask you all about: how we achieve change. So if that hasn't come up in audience questions, I will save that up to the end. But Louise, do you want to reflect at all on these trade-offs?
I don't think I've got anything huge to add. I think it's just a difficult one to sort of say. Is Ellie, for instance, a backbencher or a frontbencher? And to MPs in larger parties, they would obviously say to me a lot, that Greens are essentially backbench MPs. And I think there's a bit of a lack of understanding about that position and what Ellie outlined at the start about, having all those multiple roles. And, you notice that when someone moves from the government or official opposition to one of the smaller parties, suddenly they realise what it's like. And, like with Change UK and those MPs, they suddenly realise and want the extra visibility and guarantees. I think that's probably all I need to say.
I feel like we might be at a kind of potentially at a kind of magic moment here, because nobody really knows after the outcome of the next election whether they're going to be a large party or a small party at the moment. So those are times when you do have the potential to agree a set of rules that everybody thinks are fair in all circumstances. But whether we're going to whether that's going to slip through our fingers, it probably will. Let's go over to Tom, who can tell us some of the questions from the audience.
All right, thanks, Meg. And I will read these out in groups of 3 or so. So the first question we have is the one that you've already raised, Meg, and it comes from John Newham, who asks, is there any chance of serious reform inside the House of Commons without proportional representation happening first? Second, a question from Danny Schindler, who thanks all the speakers for their contributions and asks, does the public care? Is there any demand for or support for more proportionality by the general public? And then David Nartzler, former clerk of the House of Commons, asks whether changes in the size of a parliamentary in the course of a parliament e.g. Reform UK now getting bigger, or the creation of new parliamentary groupings, like your party, whether that should be reflected in these various arrangements, including short money.
Okay, who would like to go first? Louise, would you like to come in on any of those? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I don't know which one to choose. I guess if I start with the last one about changes during the course of the Parliament. I think the Welsh Assembly is a good example of how difficult it can be when things change during the course of a Parliament, and party rights automatically change as a result of that. And I'm thinking back to speaking to UKIP MPs, for example, a few years ago, and they were chopping and changing a lot in terms of committees that they suddenly lost the right to be on and things, and it created a bit of chaos within the party group. So I think that's a real challenging one, and it's something that if we start to write things down and if parties start to change in size more often, then we'd have to deal with that in the standing orders, and we probably should deal with it in the standing orders. And then the first question about any chance of serious reform. I think what happened last summer with the Procedure Committee's report, where they suggested to government that there was a debate on party rights, and the government said, no, we haven't absolutely got no time for this. It should go to the Backbench Business Committee instead, is perhaps an indication that if there is any reform, that it will have to be led by probably those smaller opposition parties.
Yeah, and of course we have a situation, it's sort of, we talk about it without explaining it often in these forums, that the government has to decide these things, because of course one of the most potentially peculiar things in standing orders is that the government has such extensive rights over time and over proposing certain types of motions and so on, that we need to look to the government often to take action on things, which in a multi-party parliament where the government might be only a minority of seats is also somewhat strange. But how you get change on those kinds of things is very tricky. Ellie?
Thanks. Yes, absolutely. Inbuilt huge government majority. So to that question, is there any chance of serious reforms kind of without proportional representation? I mean, the short and cynical answer is no, because no government turkey is going to vote for Christmas, basically. And while you suggested this kind of wonderful idea of maybe we're in a kind of veil of ignorance situation currently, where we can all kind of decide in a beautifully unbiased way on what would be the best system to work within. I mean, the reality is we know the government absolutely does not work like that. It's not thinking like that about electoral reform, and it's not thinking like that about Commons reform either. So realistically, probably there is a chance of small, incremental, step-by-step reforms of the sorts that we have seen, and there is this chance to argue for certainly greater codification. But I confess I'm deeply disappointed by the failure of the Modernisation Committee to do this, because, at the time of the formation, the July 2024 general election, I thought, this is the moment, right? We've got all of these fresh-faced, bushy-tails, whatever, bright-eyed bushy-tails, new MPs. Yes, so many of them are on the government side, but they're younger. They've got different kind of perspectives. They've got a kind of sense of wanting to change the place, that the way that this place works. Maybe this is the moment for a breath of fresh air to kind of waft through. And it seems to me that any evanescent hope that there might have been for that has swiftly evaporated. Basically, does the public care about the proportionality of time allocation within the functioning of Parliament? No. I mean, let's be really honest about this. Most of the members of the public don't understand the ins and outs of the way that Parliament works, because it is so flipping hard to get a handle on. It's so untransparent. It's so complex. I think if the public understood that better, then they might care more. But actually, in my view, what they should care most about is the fact that we have such a sclerotic political system, essentially, because we have such an unrepresentative political system, and so many people's political views are not not represented in the way that MP seats are distributed. On this final question, should changes in size of group during Parliament be reflected in changes in parliamentary time and short money? Short money, no, because that's about your support, that's about your vote at the general election. I think that there should be some flexibility. So, for example, I don't know, if you had dozens of MPs kind of moving to a different political group, it would be weird, and that was a permanent state of affairs. It would be frankly weird for them not to have any allocation of parliamentary time or treatment as a group. But at the same time, you don't want to kind of create too many incentives for people to go jumping about, and too much administrative hoo-ha of people having to be taken off committees and in the same way that Louise was talking about. So again, the process of writing those things down, if that was under the auspices of a business committee or some sort of more structured way of organising things, I think that would be helpful. It's never going to completely replace the usual channels, the one-to-one conversations, the sort of flexibility that is part of the WD-40 of how Parliament works, I suppose. But greater clarity and transparency, I think, would be super helpful, including potentially reflecting some changes in group size in some allocation of resource.
Thank you so much. And then finally, Paul, you raised this earlier, and I was going to throw it back to you. So when you're thinking about the possibilities of reform, it'd be interesting to know from you what you think the sort of vehicles for reform could be, and why there's so much stickiness in the system. That thing that you described before, whereby the usual channels are kind of maintaining the duopoly, is that a failure by the other smaller parties, particularly the Liberal Democrats, to somehow break that open? And I was struck that Louise mentioned how she'd been quite looking forward to chaos if there were two parties of an equal number. I mean, is the threat of chaos after a future election perhaps enough to encourage people to take some preemptive action?
Parliament isn't good at looking to its future on the whole. One thing we could borrow from the New Zealand as Commons, for example, as representatives, is that they have a standing requirement to review and revise their standing orders before the end of each Parliament and agree new ones for the new Parliament. And that is a good system, because if you don't know that you're going to win the next election, you're going to be prepared to take a bit more of a punt, a bit more of a risk on change, which might work to your advantage or might work to your disadvantage. The balance is much finer. So an impending crisis, I think, could concentrate minds on change. I just wanted to respond to do the public care? No, they're not paid to care about parliamentary procedure, and they never have, and they never will. But if you went around and asked the public, do you think Parliament should represent the voices of all the electorate as far as possible, or at least major sections of the electorate reasonably fairly, they would say yes, and they do care about that. We have to find the mechanism to make that work. And on, you mentioned how do we make the change happen? Well, the business committee is one way, because it could take, depending on how it was structured, the control over the agenda that the government currently exercises. It could retrench that control. It could give more control to the smaller parties, potentially. It could at least give people the chance to start the initiative of change, which is one of the major problems. It's not just that they can't they can't secure change with votes. It's they can't even get the idea on the agenda. So I think that's quite an important change. And finally, on David Lance's question on should things reflect changes over the course of Parliament, my general answer is no. We rely on elections. General elections are our marker for 5 years, 4 or 5 years, and that introduces a degree of stability in the system, which is desirable. There will be fluctuations between those two general elections, which, unless they become grotesque, I think we should probably feel able to broadly ignore and say, you get your chance at the next general election.
And I do remember I raised this in a blog post years ago when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, as to what would happen if Labour split, and actually the Labour Party was the smaller half of the split. And I suppose there is a potential, if sufficient Conservatives went to reform, the Liberal Democrats could become the largest party, and that would look very odd if it didn't get
it would
taken into account, I think.
It would look very odd.
Yeah,
No.
although probably very unlikely, but let's see.
Well,
Tom,
I just... No.
Tom, you've got more questions for us.
Yep, thanks, Meg. So Matthew England from the Hansard Society asks, what arrangements should be made to accommodate independent MPs and groupings of independent MPs, particularly if their number continues to grow? Monica Hartman has a question which she suggests Ellie might be particularly well placed to answer, which is to what extent are MPs from small parties able to send members of staff to events like committee sessions that they're unable to attend themselves? If that's not possible, should it be, or would this raise issues? And then Tom Brake highlights that we've been talking about opposition so far, but what would the panel suggest is done when a coalition government is formed in terms of how different parties within the coalition are recognised or not as independent bodies?
Tom himself being a former member of the Liberal Democrats during coalition, I believe, so he's no doubt got his own views on that. Should we go to Ellie first on this round?
Thank you. What arrangements should be made to accommodate independent MPs? Well, kind of as I was saying earlier, I think we need a combination of greater structure and transparency and things written down, plus still a bit of flexibility. So treatment of independence, making sure that everybody does have an opportunity to make their voice heard, particularly on issues that they are particularly associated with, I think is good. I think there's a real question about if a bunch of people get elected as independents and then want to form a party afterwards, there is it is kind of inevitable that is something that is scrutinised quite carefully. Is that because they have actually got a kind of strong party identity together, or because they want access to particularly if party identity is associated with distribution of resources such as parliamentary time, maybe even finance, seats on committees and so forth. So yeah, that's about my views on that. To what extent can MPs send staff to, e.g. committee sessions? I mean, staff cannot deputise for MPs at all. I mean, other MPs cannot deputise for MPs. So one flexibility that could be, I served as a councillor for 7 years. If I wasn't able to kind of turn up to my meeting of whatever scrutiny committee, I could send another councillor from my political group to represent and vote on that committee in my place. That is absolutely not doable within existing select committee or bill committee structures. It could potentially be something that could help with the kind of flexibility that particularly hits small parties when one individual is torn in multiple directions, but it's not it's not a permanent solution to that. I don't think staff shouldn't be able to kind of go and do that. Of course, they can go and sit in if it's a public session and listen. What about if a coalition is formed? I mean, it's the $64 million question, isn't it? And I confess I have obviously started thinking about that issue, Tom, but I haven't got as far as thinking about how should party rights kind of be balanced with coalition identity. My gut feeling is that it is still important, that if parties are working in coalition, and I honestly actually don't have enough knowledge of how this works in many other polities where these things are very, very common, but I would assume that there is also space for parties to speak as parties as well as part of the government. And this kind of goes to this core of the relationship between the legislature and the executive. And we have a situation in which we have a very defanged legislature. And I would strongly support creating much more space in some of the ways that Paul has sort of touched on for MPs to control the allocation of time within Parliament, and not just backbench business debates, opportunities to kind of toss an idea around, but space to bring forward bills, space to force votes. I think that more power for the legislature would be a really, really helpful thing in relation to what we currently have as very power centralised in the executive system.
Thank you. Louise?
Yeah. So if I start with the independent MPs question, I think the difference with independent MPs, obviously, that they're not doing that front bench job that Ellie and other small party MPs are doing. So I think it's right that they are treated slightly differently in terms of party rights. Other parliaments do have systems where you can kind of come together from different parties, don't they? And reach that threshold, say, and then acquire some rights. I'm a bit unsure about that. because I feel like if you were then getting extra rights, you're there as a backbencher, you're not there as a frontbencher, which is what party rights should be doing. So perhaps something, but they should be very different from other party group rights, I think. Coalition, I feel like I don't know enough about how party rights were just debated in 2010. But I remember stuff about short money, and I remember something about bill committee allocations and the splits between them. But I don't think I know enough to have a thorough opinion on that right now. And so I defer to Paul.
We all defer to Paul. Shall we turn to Paul to think about those questions? And I mean, you were there when the last coalition government was operating, and behind the scenes, maybe thinking about some of the procedural challenges. Of course, minority government is another challenge which you might reflect on, and we could even have both at once. A minority, if Louise really wants chaos, 2 equal-sized opposition parties and a minority coalition government.
Well,
your final thoughts.
you only have to go to Dublin to see how all these things work, where you have a minority coalition government, a lot of independence, and a lot of complicated procedural issues. When the coalition was in existence, it was treated entirely as the two parties were treated as a single block for all practical purposes, for procedural and for money purposes, essentially. So there was no distinction made for them. The coalition in Ireland, for example, an interesting example is where they swapped prime ministers halfway through the term of office as part of their coalition agreement. So you can do all kinds of creative things. Also in the Dáil, you will see that independents are able to form technical groups. I think 7 is the minimum number for a technical group, which is a quasi-party, but it gives them access to certain speaking rights and I think some financial support as well in a technical group. And they don't really have to prove anything except that the 7 of them have agreed to form this group. It became a big issue because 7 of them formed a technical group to prop up the current coalition, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael coalition, and then try to claim their opposition rights as well at the same time. And this caused a complete breakdown of the system, and the Parliament, the Dáil, was brought to a halt for several weeks whilst this issue was thrashed out. So I think the rule that you can't be both opposition and government is probably a good one, to be honest, and we do well to stick to it. I think that's. Were there other things I was supposed to give a high-level answer to?
You might give an absolute slap on the wrist to the idea of staff standing in for MPs at committees.
I can happily support. I was glad Ellie, who I suspected might be unsound on this as an MP, was completely sound on this. No, you can't have staff standing in for MPs. MPs are elected, and that anoints them in a particular way, which they cannot delegate to their staff. And so in terms of actual procedures, I mean, staff have much access and opportunity to see and support their MPs, but they can't replace them.
Thank you. I think what we hear from that and from things that Ellie have said is just how enormously challenging actually it is to be a small party. We defer to you as well on just how hard you must work to hold all these, to keep all these balls in the air at the same time, and the kind of day that you were describing that you could have today. We're running out of time now, so it's just for me to say thank you so much to all of our speakers. You all brought so much wisdom and interest to this discussion, and I think that it's really complicated. We could have gone on for an awful lot longer, and maybe we'll return to this topic at some time before the next election, although who knows when that's coming. Thank you so much to the audience for attending, listening, for your questions. Sorry if your question didn't get called. I said earlier on that there will be a video of this session posted shortly on the Constitution Unit website and YouTube channel, and the audio will become a Constitution Unit podcast. So if you've enjoyed it, want to listen back, want to recommend it to your friends, please go to our website to look for it. I can let you know that our next webinar in February on the 26th at lunchtime will be answering the question, or seeking to answer the question, is the monarchy sufficiently accountable? That's already on our website. A link has just gone into the chat, so you can click through to it now or go to our website and register for it. To be sure you hear about our upcoming events and publications, if you haven't done so already, do sign up to our mailing list, which you can get to via the Get Involved link on our website. You can follow us on LinkedIn and Blue Sky as well. And finally, if you haven't already done so, can I encourage members of the audience and indeed the panel to fill in our current short survey about people's views on the Constitution Unit's work. It takes only a few minutes and it's available on the home page of our website. But we're now at 2 o'clock. That is it from us today. I hope that you all enjoyed the event and we hope to see you at another event very soon. Bye-bye.